Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing my colleague and friend, Todd Bolai, Todd. And Todd will be reading Purgatorio 22, which some of you may know is a very powerful and profound canto. It's a wonderful canto. Todd Bolai has been an active participant in our public reading of the Divine Comedy. He presented Inferno 10 and 21 with all the demons and military imagery, and Purgatorio 8. He is a poet, he's a musician, a teacher, a collector, a publisher. He is the treasurer and secretary of the, have you passed the baton? Of the Dantis, of the Dantis Society of America. And I think that all of these multiple experiences come to bear on his readings of the Divine Comedy, which are invariably elegant and eloquent, subtle and profound. And that is what I have to say about you, Todd. So, vi lascio la parola.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, thank you, Professor Shepard, for your very kind words. Welcome back. We're complete now that you're with us again. And thank you, Professor Mazzola, for your invitation. To all of you devoted readers of Dante, welcome back, and thank you for your presence here this evening. I'm going to be we'll be discussing Statius's Thebaid and Achilleid tonight, and I thought I'd just take a minute and tell you about these works. The Thebaid is the more important of the two in that it is a completed epic poem written about a century after Virgil's Aeneid, with emulation of the Aeneid very much in mind. The Thebaid tells the story of the seven against Thebes, how after Oedipus's death, his and Jocasta's two sons, Polynices and Eteocles, take over the government of the city of Thebes, and they agree that instead of fighting over who will be the sole ruler, they'll share the command of the city by alternating years of being the prince. Eteocles goes first. Polynices waits his year. When the year is up, Eteocles balks at the agreement, expels Polynices. Polynices, in his exile, seeks refuge with the Argives and seeks help from their prince Adrastus, who five other princes, so that now we have the two of them and the five making the seven against Thebes. Chief among those is another exile by the name of Tidus. He marries one of Adrastus's daughters. Polynices marries one of Adrastus's daughters. And they all get killed in trying to take over, settle the question of the government of the strife-torn city of Thebes. The Achilleus is about Achilles. It's incomplete. There's only about a 1.5 of what appear to have been an intended 12 books. Statius died before he was able to conclude it. We don't know what the whole thing was going to look like, but the brief beginning that survives talks mostly about Achilles' education as a youth and his mother, the goddess Thetis's attempt to keep him from joining the Trojan War, where it is prophesied that he will die. Dante's Purgatorio, and we have this title, Following to Surpass. In the 22nd canto of Dante's Purgatorio, narration of what might be called the programmatic or organizational activities of purgatory, activities like the encounter with the different forms of penance, the presentation of examples of the purged sins and their corresponding virtues, the encounter with the angelic guardians, and the recitation of the appropriate beatitudes. The narration of these activities is limited to the canto's beginning and its end. The canto opens with a passage which indicates in a brief 9 lines the guardian angel's removal of a P from Dante's forehead, the angel's quotation of one of the Beatitudes, Dante's exit along with Virgil and the recently encountered Statius from Purgatory's 5th circle, and the 3 poets setting out for the 6th. Lines 130 to 154, with which the canto concludes, relate the arrival of the poets in the circle of the gluttonous and their encounter with the strange tree and the voice that invokes examples of abstemiousness from the New Testament, Old Testament, and pagan antiquity. The only action that takes place in the canto's long central portion, lines 10 to 129, is the poet's swift passage from the one circle to the other. What the comedy does with this bare and otherwise brief narrative interval is to fill it with an extended dialogue between Virgil and Statius, which manages, among other things, to serve the poem's own self-legitimating purposes. The dialogue between Virgil and Statius compares their respective poetic works in a way that seems to promise that Dante's comedy will supersede the works of both. The explicit comparison between Virgil and Statius carries with it an implied comparison between the two of them and Dante, and by means of this implied comparison, the poet of the comedy advances the authority of his own poem's urgent purpose and message. Rather than narrating the angel's cancellation of the P from Dante's forehead and the poet's departure for the next circle, the canto opens by merely indicating that this episode has already taken place and that the poets are now on their way. This narrative abbreviation underlines the gathering speed that attends the poets in their ascent, and it recalls what Virgil promises back in Purgatory 4 to encourage Dante in his climb. This mountain is such that below at the beginning the going is difficult, but the further up one goes, the easier it becomes. The compression of these brief introductory lines also suggests the narrative's eagerness to proceed to the treatment of the canto's major concern, the dialogue between Virgil and Statius. This dialogue, which begins with the canto's 10th verse and extends for 120 verses, is longer than some entire cantos. Purgatory 22 is one of the rare cantos in which Dante the character does not speak. Nonetheless, Dante's lively attention to Statius and Virgil's conversation and his reception of its meaning, both for himself and for the poem that he will return to write, succeed in making Dante, both as character in the poem and as the comedy's author, the canto's real subject. In verses 10 to 24, Virgil asks Statius to explain how so wise a person as he could be guilty of avarice. And to appeal to Statius's goodwill and enlist his willingness to answer, he begins his request by explaining that he has cherished a benvolienza, benevolence, for Statius ever since the Roman poet Juvenal arrived in Limbo and related to Virgil the affezione, affection, that Statius entertained for him. This is the second of only 2 times in the entire comedy that the word limbo appears, and the word simultaneously recalls the presentation of Limbo in the fourth canto of the Inferno, and, beginning with Juvenal, introduces an expansion of the roster of the souls that the poem locates there. The expansion is not due to any fundamental rethinking of the Inferno's presentation of Limbo, but is occasioned by the comedy's search for a pretext that will account for an intimacy between Statius and Virgil, an intimacy that Dante needs if he is going to construct between them a conversation that will carry forward the justification Dante offers for his own poetic project. Since Statius was born at least a quarter of a century after Virgil died, to represent Statius as admiring Virgil presents no challenge. Statius's admiration for Virgil was not something Dante had to invent, as he was, like every medieval scholar, well familiar with Statius's great Latin epic poem, the Thebaid, whose conclusion contains the famous passage in which the poet, as he takes leave of his poem, pays homage to his great predecessor. Thrive, I pray you, and do not seek to rival the divine Aeneid, but follow well behind and always worship its footsteps. However, to have Virgil esteem Statius requires some contrivance, and in Juvenal, Dante finds just the contrivance he needs. In his seventh satire, Juvenal writes about Statius's fame and the popularity of his Thebaid, and Dante makes use of these details to lend authority to his portrait of Statius in the Purgatorio. Juvenal even alludes to Statius's uncertain finances, and the allusion may have spurred Dante to think about Statius in terms of the prodigality that is assigned to him in this canto. What serves Dante's immediate purpose, however, is that Juvenal's satires suggest that he knew Statius personally. It is this suggestion of Juvenal's friendship with Statius that gives Dante an historical figure who can plausibly descend to Limbo, tell Virgil about Statius's life and works and about Statius's affection for him, and thereby create a plausible basis for Virgil's corresponding goodwill towards Statius. Since Juvenal, who revealed to me your affection, came down among us in hell's limbo, my goodwill towards you has been greater than ever gripped an unseen person. When Virgil asks Statius how he could be so wise and yet have been avaricious, his opinion of Statius as wise is doubtless meant to be understood as deriving from what Juvenal has told him. In lines 25 to 54, Statius explains that Virgil is mistaken to infer from Statius's having been in the fifth circle that he was necessarily avaricious. Statius discloses that in life he was in fact the opposite of avaricious, and that he had not read, and that had he not read, a certain passage in Virgil's Aeneid, and subtly interpreted it as condemning prodigality as a sin, instead of purging his sin in purgatory, Statius would instead have suffered the punishment set aside for the prodigals in hell. And if it had not been that I righted my concern, I would be circling and tilting in the squalid tournaments. Voltando sentirei le giostre grame. Statius relates that it was his reading of Virgil that led him to repent, not only of the sin of prodigality, but of his other sins as well. And he laments that not knowing prodigality as a sin deprives people of the chance to repent. He then points out, by way of corollary, that if a sin constitutes the direct opposite of another sin punished in purgatory, the two sins are punished there together. And know that the fault that mirrors any sin in direct opposition withers away here together with that sin. This passage has its challenges. It perplexes this reader how Statius's reading of less than 2 lines of the Aeneid should lead him not just to the correction of his prodigality, but to the curing of all his other vices as well. And I repented of that as well as of my other sins. That the power of the Virgilian passage should be so great that it persuades Statius to conduct not just a limited self-appraisal, but a general moral inventory seems, I think, an exaggeration that distracts from the canto's focus. It may also be asked how Statius knows that the prodigals in hell are punished by colliding with the avaricious. His use of the word giostre, contests or tilts, plainly refers to how the Inferno characterizes the behavior of hell's prodigals. Compare Statius's voltando sentirei le giostre grame with the Inferno's percoteansi incontro, poi si volgea ciascun per lo suo mezzo cerchio all'altra giostra. They would hurl themselves against each other, then each would turn back through its half of the circle to the other clash. However, readers may be left to puzzle out for themselves how Statius has this knowledge of hell, clearly Dante is thinking of the earlier passage. What especially requires explanation is how Virgil, who in the Inferno understands the relationship the prodigality has with avarice as an opposite and complementary sin, here seems not to be mindful of the connection and must rely on Statius to point it out. When in hell's 4th circle, Dante and Virgil encounter the avaricious and the prodigal colliding and shouting at each other, Dante asks Virgil to tell him who they are, and he answers that they all spent without moderation, that they are divided into 2 opposing groups according to their opposing sins, and that those who were misers must collide eternally with those who are shorn of their belongings. They were all so cross-eyed in their minds in the first life that there they spent without measure. Their voices bark it out with great clarity when they come to the 2 extremes of the circle where the opposite sin divides them. Eternally they shall come to the 2 collisions. These will rise from the grave tight-fisted, and these shorn of their hair. Ill-giving and ill-keeping has deprived them of the beautiful world and landed them in this free-for-all. It should be apparent that Dante has not deprived Virgil of this knowledge because Dante has forgotten this episode of the Inferno. The echoes and reminiscences of this canto of the Inferno found in the canto we read tonight are so numerous and striking that it truly seems Dante wants us to notice them. The colpa contraria of Inferno 7 recurs in Purgatorio 22 in colpa che rimbecca per dritto opposizione and per lo contrario suo. Other repeated vocabulary, and even the rhyme triplet cerchio, coperchio, soperchio, could perhaps be overlooked as coincidence, but surely the recurrence of questi resurgeranno del sepulcro col pugno chiuso e questi coi crin mozzi as quanti resurgeranno coi crini scemi is too striking to escape notice. Nevertheless, in this episode of the Purgatorio, Dante seems to deprive Virgil of any recollection of the connection between avarice and prodigality that he and Dante had observed in hell. The poet has even gone out of his way in the preceding 3 cantos to keep Virgil and Dante from running into any of the 5th circle's prodigals, who are presumably as is suggested here in Purgatorio 22, also punished there along with the avaricious. In Purgatorio 22, Dante is plainly suppressing Virgil's knowledge of this moral lesson that Virgil himself imparts in Inferno 7. Why? The passage of Purgatorio 22 that follows suggests an answer. When Statius explains that he has discerned in Virgil's bucolics an unconscious prophecy of the advent of Christ, he famously proclaims that Virgil is like a person who carries the lamp behind himself and does not benefit himself, but benefits only those who follow him. By having Statius interpret a passage from the Aeneid as condemning prodigality, when Virgil seems to have meant it only to condemn avarice, Dante manages to cast Virgil as the unwitting prophet in the first part of Virgil and Statius's long dialogue, as well as in the second part. Why Dante is so insistent on transforming Virgil from a sage to an unwitting prophet, and so eager to extend the transformation from the Virgil of the bucolics to embrace the Virgil of the Aeneid as well, is what the second part of the Virgil-Statius dialogue is all about. In lines 55 to 63, Virgil asks Statius to explain, if as it seems Statius was not a Christian when he wrote the Thebaid, how he afterwards came to set his sails to follow the fishermen, that is, how he joined the followers of St. Peter or converted to Christianity. The quando, when, and pascha, thereafter, of Virgil's question underline the chronological perplexity that Virgil seems to have labored under ever since Statius, resorting to a bit of equivocation, identified himself in the previous canto. In Purgatorio 21, Statius tells Virgil that he lived under the Emperor Vespasian and was famous for his poetry, though not yet a Christian. If, as Juvenal relates, Juvenal, that is, who in the comedy is Virgil's source for what he knows about Statius, if, according to Juvenal, Statius's poetic fame was owed chiefly to his Thebaid, then what Statius says in Purgatorio 21 about being famous before he had faith must necessarily suggest to Virgil that Statius did not become a Christian until after he had written the Thebaid. The impression that Statius leaves in Purgatory 21 is that the Thebaid came early and his conversion came pascha, thereafter. However, the Thebaid, as its opening dedication plainly reveals, was written not during the reign of Vespasian, but during the reign of Domitian, the successor of Vespasian's son, Titus. It is natural, then, for Virgil to suspect that Statius might possibly, despite suggestions to the contrary, have become a Christian before writing the Thebaid, and to be curious as to the actual circumstances of Statius's conversion. Note Virgil's skepticism when he observes that it doesn't seem, to judge from what one reads in the Thebaid, that Statius had yet become a Christian, and he asks Statius point blank to tell him if this is so. From what Clio sounds out there with you, it doesn't seem that you were made faithful yet by the faith without which good works are insufficient. If this is so, what sun or what candles so dispelled the shadows for you that thereafter you directed your sails behind the fishermen? In lines 64 to 73, Statius gives the first part of his answer, the part that honors Virgil. In the previous canto, Statius has already declared his poetic debt to Virgil, though at that point he is unaware that the person he is addressing is Virgil himself. Now Statius makes his famous declaration claiming that the Virgil who led him to poetry also miraculously and providentially led him to Christianity. Just as Virgil had first set him on his way to Parnassus, so Virgil also first illuminated his understanding of God by way of the famous passage in the Bucolics, in which he seems, carrying the light behind him and benefiting those who follow, unwittingly to foretell the coming of Christ. Statius has already confessed Virgil as the source of his moral conversion, and now he declares Virgil the source of both his poetic achievement and his conversion to the true faith. Through you, I was a poet. Through you, a Christian. By making these claims for Statius, Dante creates an authorization for the radical poetic construct that he himself is attempting. His poetry, like Virgil's, will be divinely inspired and bear the gift of prophetic truth. Moreover, Dante's message will be to a very large extent the same as Virgil's, namely that the Roman Empire is providentially ordained. Dante's conviction that the Aeneid's core idea is true and valid for all time, and that Virgil speaks with divine authority, is already present in the fourth and final book of Dante's abandoned Convivio. There, he sets forth what might justly be characterized as the single most original, daring, and dangerous idea of his intellectual career, that the Roman Empire is divinely ordained as the necessary historical prerequisite for the incarnation of Jesus Christ and the spread of the Christian gospel. Especially daring is that to support its proposition, the Convivio first cites not Holy Scripture, but the Aeneid, claiming that empire, quote, was not in the beginning obtained by the Roman people by force, but by divine providence, which transcends all reason. And in this, Virgil agrees in the first book of the Aeneid when he says, speaking in the person of God, to them, that is to the Romans, I set no limit on the time or extent of their possessions. To them I have given empire without end. Unquote. What Dante is given to see, however, that Virgil is not, is that the true purpose of the Roman Empire was to prepare the way for Christianity. Dante's belief that empire is not just for the ancient Romans, but for the Christians of his own day, is plain from the pro-imperial polemic that runs through every sinew of the comedy. As Virgil directed Statius verso Parnaso aber nelle sue grotte, toward Parnassus to drink in its grottos, so Virgil at the beginning of the Inferno appears as the poet from whom Dante has taken lo bello stilo che m'ha fatto onore, the fair style that has done me honor. As Statius reads in Virgil's poetry the message of Christian salvation that Virgil himself could not see, so Dante can see in the Aeneid what Virgil could not, the Christian reason for Rome's imperial destiny. Though Virgil could not know the Christian dimension of his providential concept of history, it is nevertheless what makes Dante's comedy possible. So the Purgatorio's Statius is made to serve as a figura or analog of Dante himself, a precedent that legitimates the poet who finds both poetic and Christian inspiration in Virgil's poetry, and intends to undertake a composition on the scale of Virgil's great epic. as Statius's conversion to Christianity begins not with the Christian preachers, but with Virgil's poetry, so the revelation of the divine necessity of empire begins for Dante not with his reading of Scripture, but with his reading of the Aeneid. All the same, the analog of Statius goes only so far. Statius's Thebaid may be content to follow the Aeneid at a respectful distance, but Dante's comedy means to surpass it. In lines 74 to 93, Statius gives the rest of his answer to Virgil and fills out his story with details that Dante freely invents. But the comedy's poet has now so artfully constructed a framework from historical materials that the fictional story, invented to exalt Dante's purpose even further, unfolds in all plausibility. The reader learns that Statius saw how the passage from Virgil's bucolics agreed with the message of the Christians and began to seek them out. Ondio a visitarli presi usata, wherefore I took the habit of visiting them. When Domitian began persecuting the Christians, I lor dritti costumi, their upright behavior, persuaded Statius, he says, of the inferiority of every other religious sect. Then comes the stunning admission that he converted and was baptized before he wrote the Thebaid, but that being fearful, presumably of losing the emperor's patronage and being persecuted himself, he remained a closet Christian, lungamente mostrando paganesimo, long pretending to be a pagan. His tepidezza, lukewarmness, he explains, kept him with the slothful in Purgatory's fourth circle for over 4 centuries. What serves Dante's purpose is not so much that Statius had Christian faith as that Statius was afraid to declare it. When Virgil's question has been answered, it retrospectively reproaches Statius's failure to imbue the Thebaid with his faith. Statius's tepidezza contrasts sadly with the example invoked in Virgil's question of Simon Peter, who, dropping his nets and following Christ, suffered the very martyrdom that was imposed on both his master and the Christians killed by Domitian. How could Statius invoke Clio, as he does in the beginning of the Thebaid, and reveal nothing of the vera credenza, the true belief? Clio is the muse of history, not make-believe. She is the daughter of memory itself, unerring memory, the divinity whom Dante invokes at the beginning of his poem, the divinity who faithfully recorded what he saw and what he will truthfully relate. The exchange between Virgil and Statius implies a criticism of Statius's truthfulness and courage. But more than that, it implies for Dante a caution and a promise that will be made explicit when, in the Paradiso, Dante hears his ancestor Cacciaguida's prophecy and receives his divine commission. With every lie removed, reveal your vision in its totality. This cry of yours will be like the wind which, the taller the eminence, the harder it strikes, and no small cause of honor will it be. The timidity of Statius stands alongside Virgil's limited understanding to indicate precisely how Dante will surpass both of his great poetic predecessors. Beginning with line 94, Statius changes the subject and inquires into the fate of various ancient poets. Virgil answers that they and others abide with him in the first circle of hell's carcere cieco, blind prison, where their talk often turns to the Muses. Thus, Terence, Caecilius, Plautus, Varius, Persius, Euripides, Antiphon, Simonides, and Agathon are added to Virgil, Horace, Ovid, and Lucan, who, as was learned in Inferno 4, make up in limbo La Bella Scola, the fair school of poets led by Homer. Virgil also names as dwellers in limbo other famous ancients who appear in Statius's Thebaid and Achilleid, although he names only women, or more precisely, the women whose husbands, sons, or lovers are killed in war, or who, as in the case of Manto, are targeted for rape, or in the cases of Hypsipyle and Diademia, are seduced by soldiers and abandoned. The reader is thus reminded of the desolation of war, especially that of civil war, for such was the war fought between the Theban brothers, Eteocles and Polynices, and retold in Statius's Thebaid. In its opening lines, the Thebaid refers to the brothers, the rule that was fatal to the double rulers. But Purgatorio 22 refers to their sorrowing mother, the cruel war of Jocasta's double grief. By making this canto's first reference to Statius's Thebaid refer not to Eteocles and Polynices directly, but by way of their mother's grief, Dante foreshadows the purpose he has for the Thebaid in the present passage, namely to show the devastation that war, especially civil war, brings to human society. At last, beginning with verse 130, when the poets have finished their climb to the circle of the gluttonous, they encounter the inverted fruit tree that addresses them with promises of abstinence and examples of abstemiousness. The long exchange between Virgil and Statius has come to its end, but even so, the canto still seems to refer to it. The voice from the tree warns, "Of this food ye shall not taste," as though it were the inversion of Eden's tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the loss sustained when humans ate from that tree should now be reversed by their abstaining from it. How appropriate that it should be Virgil and Statius who first approach the tree and hear its declaration. Virgil, to whom history denied revealed knowledge, and Statius, to whom revelation was given only to remain concealed. The tree cites its examples from pagan antiquity, from the Old Testament and New, of those who abstained from gluttony, and its list ends with John the Baptist. The Baptist, of course, is the patron saint de la città partita, of the divided city, Dante's strife-torn native city of Florence. There may be, however, a way of thinking of St. John as an analog to this canto's two great ancient poets. At the end of the long dialogue between Virgil and Statius, Dante is still following them, but now listening to their words, "which gave me understanding for writing poetry." I personally like to think he's triangulating as he listens, learning how to avoid, on the one hand, Virgil's tragedy of speaking without understanding, and on the other, Statius's tragedy of understanding without speaking. Dante's following Virgil and Statius must surely remind the reader of the respectful distance which Statius bids his Thebaid to keep as it follows the Aeneid. However, now that at the canto's very end we read about John the Baptist and his story in the Gospel, it may be more fitting to think of Dante as being like the one who will follow St. John, and of the poem he is thinking about writing as being like divine scripture, in that it will relate a vision of human history not as his predecessors Virgil and Statius may have understood it, but in Christian terms. For Dante will write his epic, as Giovanni Boccaccio put it so aptly, non mica come gentile, ma come cristianissimo poetando, not at all as a pagan, but as a poet, most Christian. Well, now let us take a breath and a little drink of water. Thank you. And let us read Purgatorio 22 together. Già era l'angel dietro a noi rimaso, l'angel che n'aveva volti al sesto giro, avendomi dal viso un colpo raso. E quei c'hanno a giustizia lor disiro detto n'avea beati, e le sue voci con sitiunt senz'altro sofforniro. E io più lieve che per l'altre voci mandava, sì che senza alcun labore seguivin su gli spiriti veloci. Quando Virgilio incominciò, amore acceso di virtù, sempre altro accese, pur che la fiamma sua paresse fuori. Onde d'allora che tra noi discese nel limbo dell'inferno giovenale, che la tua affezion mi fe palese, mia benvoglienza in verso te fu quale più strinse mai di non vista persona. Sicor mi parran corte queste scale. Ma dimmi, e come amico mi perdona se troppa sicurtà m'allarghi il freno, e come amico mai meco ragiona? Come potei trovar dentro al tuo senno loco avarizia tra cotanto senno, di quanto per tua cura fosti pieno? Queste parole mover fenno un poco a riso pria, queste parole stazio mover fenno un poco a riso pria, poscia rispose, ogni tuo dir d'amor me caro cenno. Veramente, più volte appaiono cose che danno a dubitar falsa matera per le vere ragioni che son nascose. La tua dimanda, tu creder, ma vera esser chi fosse avaro in l'altra vita, forse per quella cerchia dove io era. Or sappi, c'avarizia fu partita troppo da me, e questa dismisura migliaia di lunari hanno punita. E se non fosse ch'io drizzai mia cura, quando io intesi là dove tu chiami, cruciato quasi all'umana natura, perché non reggi tu, o sacra fame dell'oro, l'appetito dei mortali, voltando sentirei le giostre grame. Allor m'accorsi che troppo aprir l'ali poten le mani a spendere, e pentemi così di quel come degli altri mali. Quanti resurgeran coi crini scemi per ignoranza che di questa pecca toglie il penter vivende negli stremi. E sappie che la colpa che rimbecca per dritta opposizione alcun peccato, con esso insieme qui su verde secca. Però s'io son tra quella gente stato che piange l'avarizia per purgarmi, per lo contrario suo m'è incontrato. Or quando tu cantasti le crude armi della doppia tristizia di Giocasta, disse il cantor dei bucolici carmi, per quello che Cliò teco li tasta. Non par che ti facesse ancor fedele la fede, senza qual ben far non basta. Se così è, qual sole o quai candele ti stenebraron sì che tu drizzasti poscia diretto al pescator le vele. Ed egli a lui, tu prima m'inviasti verso Parnaso a ber nelle sue grotte e prima presso Dio m'illuminasti. Facesti come quei che va di notte, che porta il lume dietro e sé non giova, ma dopo sé fa le persone dotte. Quando dicesti, secol si rinnova, torna giustizia e primo tempo umano, e progenie scende da ciel nova. Per te, poeta fui, per te, cristiano. Ma perché veggi me ciò ch'io disegno, a colorare stenderò la mano. Già era il mondo tutto quanto pregno della vera credenza, seminata per i messaggi dell'eterno regno, e la parola tua sopratoccata si consonava ai nuovi predicanti, ond'io a visitarli presi usata. Vennermi poi, parendo tanto santi, che quando Domizian li perseguette, senza mio lagrimar non fur lor pianti. E mentre che di là per me si stette, io li sovenni, e lor dritti costumi per dispregiar a me tutt'altre sette. E pria ch'io conducessi Grecia ai fiumi di Tebe poetando, ebbi o battesimo, ma per paura, chiuso Cristian fumi, lungamente mostrando paganesimo, e questa tepidezza il quarto cerchio, cerchiar mi fe più che il quartocentesimo. Tu dunque, che levata hai il coperchio, che m'ascondeva quanto ben io dico, mentre che del salire ven soverchio, dimmi, dov'è Terenzio nostro antico, Cecilio e Plaute e Varro, se lo sai. Dimmi, se son dannati, e in qual vico. Costore Persio, e io, e altri assai, rispose il duca mio, siam con quel greco che le muse lattar più ch'altri mai, nel primo cinghio del carcere cieco. Spesse fiate ragioniam del monte che sempre alle nutrice nostre seco. Euripide, Venosco e Antifonte, Simonide, Agatone e altri più e greci, che già di lauro ornar la fronte. Quivi si veggion delle genti tue, Antigone, Deifile e Argia, e Ismene sì trista come fue. Vedesi quella che mostrò l'Angia, Evvi la figlia di Tiresia, e Teti, e con le suore sue, Deida mia. Tacevan siambe due gialli poeti, di nuovo attenti a riguardar d'intorno, liberi da saliri e da pareti. E già le quattro ancelle eran del giorno, rimasa dietro, e la quinta era al temo, drizzando pur in su l'ardente corno. Quando il mio duca, io credo ch'allo stremo le destre spalle volger ne convegna, girando il monte come far solemo. Così l'usanza fu lì nostra insegna, e prendemmo la via con men sospetto per la sentir di quell'anima degna. Egli givan dinanzi, e io soletto di retro, e ascoltavi lor sermoni, ch'a poetar mi davano intelletto. Ma tosto ruppe le dolci ragioni un alber che trovammo in mezza strada con pomi a odorar soave e buoni. E come abete in alto si digrada di ramo in ramo, così quello in giuso, credio, perché persona su non vada. Dal lato onde il cammin nostro era chiuso, cadè dall'alta roccia un liquor chiaro e si spandeva per le foglie suso. Le due poete all'alber s'appressarono e una voce per entro le fronde gridò: di questo cibo avrete caro. Poi disse: più pensava Marionde fosser le nozze orrevoli e intere, ch'alla sua bocca cor per voi risponde. E le romane antiche per lor bere contente furon d'acqua, e Daniello dispregiò cibo e acquistò savere. Lo secol primo, quant'oro fu bello, fe savorose con fame le ghiande e nettere con sete ogni ruscello. Me le locuste furon le vivande che nodrirò il Battista nel deserto, perché egli è glorioso e tanto grande quanto per lo Vangelio v'è aperto. Well, thank you very much. Now comes the part I enjoy most, where you contribute your questions and observations, and I know I shall learn from them, so please. Vincent.
The art of feeding the hunger that you inspire. So I may not be the only person who feels quite content at the end. But could you perhaps expand a bit on the presence of all of the female characters that you listed for us? Is there any particular significance to be given to that, do you think? We don't have a lot of women, through the comedy. So is this cluster?
Well, it is interesting to me that there's no need to single. I mean, these women are. These are among those personages in limbo who are not there so much for extraordinary virtue, but because fame, their fame that lasts in the world, succeeds in gaining favor for them from heaven. So certainly Eteocles, Polynices, Attis and Adrastus are every bit as much as famous, perhaps more so, than the women, although the women figure very prominently in both of Statius's poems. But I think it's striking that he decides to name only. I mean, even when he has to name Eteocles and Polynices, he calls them, with a paraphrastic saying they're the double grief of their mother's double grief. All I can suggest is what I just suggested here, that if we focus on the women who are not the people out there fighting this war, but ones who do nothing more than suffer its ravages and predations and desolations, we're reminded of how awful civil war is. Civil war. I mean, you have to think that the Thebaid, which was known very well and which Dante was probably taught by Brunetto Latini as a young man, that it must have made him think a lot about, since Polynices is an exile, and Thebes is a city like Florence divided into factions, and the factions make alliances with external foreign powers. When Dante must have begun to think about this again in his own exile, it must have stricken him with great vividness and force how vivid a parallel this presented to Florence and his own experience. And it was grist to his mill. Yeah.
I'm just looking at this, the pastor is given a different role in the Phoebe than he is in Sophocles, right? Because in Oedipus Rex, she's dedicated that play long before the son passed.
Well, I have more knowledge of Sophocles than Dante, and far less, than his knowledge of Statius. But
But she was that long before.
right. Dante, of course, did not know the Greek poets, except for what few quotations of them could be found in such Latin writers as were still read in that moment before the explosive recovery of antiquity in Renaissance humanism. He didn't know anything about. Well, unless he's taking such. Well, perhaps. I guess I think that's unlikely. And let me suggest this instead: that there were various versions, probably many various versions of these stories. And if we take ourselves back into antiquity, when these things weren't something from the past, but were, part of the stories that children heard from their aunts and uncles by the fireside at night, and they read them in school, I imagine there were different versions, and there are probably long arguments in the tabernae, over which version was right, the version that has Jocasta die early or the version that has Jocasta die late. She kills herself in Statius with Laius's sword after the death of Eteocles and Polynices. And you can remind me if in Sophocles she's dead before they die. That's right. That's right. She hangs herself. Well, thank you. I told you I would learn from you.
Right. Well, that's what was struck me because the pastor and Oedipus, that would be the thing like an old ballad. That's the thing that you remember is the incest and the gouging out his eye and things like that. You think that's something that vivid to kind of take over rather than
Well, this same sort of question comes up with the Christianity of Statius among Dante scholars. Is this something that enjoyed some legendary currency in Dante's times? Was there some thinking that, at least by some, that Statius had been secretly a Christian, and Dante took it and made it a hinge of this, one of the structural elements of this narrative. While that would be interesting to be able to settle that question, I think that if personally, I think Dante just invented it out of whole cloth because he needed it, and it serves his purposes so brilliantly. But whether he had it there to work with and expand on and develop, or whether he invented it from whole cloth, it meets his purposes.
Well, invented from whole cloth maybe, but you were nice enough to point out that Statius himself, in the concluding dedication of the Cadia, says that following Aeneas, just like he said, he's following Virgil, who's like holding the man behind. So this following from behind is actually a requote of an actual line of Statius.
it's interesting to me that Virgil not only knows all about Statius, but he's practically able to quote the Thebaid chapter and verse, as though when Juvenal came down to Limbo, he brought the Loeb Library with him, and but then again, poetry was oral, and you can make a kind of explanation for how it is that Virgil Dante kind of gives you these little suggestions, and of course he has Juvenal, who's a source he can cite to work with. But there's a lot in this canto, I think, that's a little ham-fisted. I don't mean that, but I mean if you step back away from the wonderful story it tells and get yourself outside of it, then you can see when Dante says "Dice il cantor dei bucolici carmi," he's really saying this is the author of the eclogues, and we're going to quote the eclogues here in just a second, so be ready. It's a curious thing it's not by chance that just that, I think, overly obvious epithet is employed for Virgil at that point. What Dante's doing throughout is weaving. He takes the historical, literary sources, the citable things that he can say, look, this is true. Look in your Juvenal, look in your Persius, look in your Statius, you'll find it right there. And he takes those things and he uses them as sort of the props for all the fiction that he stretches between them, and makes out of the whole a very, an amazing. What we didn't have a chance to talk about are the things that are really poetic about Dante's poetry, the natural psychology with which this conversation is provoked. It unfolds, it has its pauses, it has its moments of skepticism, of eagerness, of self-serving, of shameful confession, all these things that that persuade us that we're not reading a poem, but this is all really happening. And then, Dante's beautiful language, Già le quattro ancelle eran del giorno, rimasa dietro, e la quinta era al temo, drizzando pur in su l'ardente corno. It's like something from out of Daniel, this rare, precious vocabulary. The 4 hours, the 4 handmaidens of the day were already left behind, and now the 5th was at the steering tiller of the chariot, pushing its golden border ever higher. It's just these are the things that are just jaw-dropping, and it's a shame that in hammering out all these issues, we can't take more time to appreciate those poetic aspects of the poem.
I thought you brought out one of the things I most appreciated about your talk was the way that you brought out the naturalness of these subdivisions and so forth. So a lot of what you said, I think, was implicit for us.
Well, thank you.
Just a moment ago, also, if Dante, obviously Virgil heard these lines quoted as you have quoted them to us in the Thebaid, it's obvious because if Juvenal would have brought that with him as the proof text of his compliment. So
yeah, exactly.
Perhaps no extensive recitation of the Thebaid was necessary.
I thank you for that trenchant observation. Although I've never heard an observation of any other sort from you, Vincent.
I'm going to take another stab
Yeah.
at the women of the Thebaid.
Oh, please do.
Well, it's such a personal canto for Dante and his whole poetic career. I mean, that seems to be here when he says, Amore accese di virtù, sempre accese, altro accese, obviously referring to Francesca. And when he says, and then he talks about how he turned to, how Virgil was mastered in virtue, in style and virtue, how he became a different kind of poet through Virgil. And so, obviously, as you said, Statius is the analog, and Statius' hesitations, I think Statius' hesitations also evoke that period when Dante couldn't find his way, couldn't bring Christianity together with the philosophy. I think.
When he was stuck on the Convivio, and I was stuck on the comedy. And
because of the language that Statius uses, it's so evocative of those early comedies, cantos. It's so evocative of Dante's language in those early cantos, the first and the second. And then, what I was thinking is maybe because we're about to meet Beatrice, it's in a way she stands as a contrast to these suffering women of the Thebaid. Maybe it's a kind of
I agree with you. I think there's a large dose of, Virgil. He certainly created some powerful female characters, Creusa and Dido, and Lavinia, and now here you have Statius just letting rip with all these wonderful feminine characters, and that I think is something that Dante carries with him from the Stil Novo, and poets of romance, the vernacular poets, and makes
these women are suffering.
An ideological part of his worldview. Sorry.
But it's just the contrast between the suffering of these women and the glory of Beatrice. Somehow, I don't know.
I agree. I think it's, it's easy, especially if we allow ourselves to slide in the wake of the Romantics and the early moderns, to see a rather paternalistic, patriarchal view of women prevalent in the comedy. But I think that's as much our illusion as it is anything real. Of course, Italy was a patriarchal society in the 13th and 14th centuries, but I think Teo Barolini has gone out of her way, in a recent article about Francesca, to take a fuller account of the real humanity and full dimension that Dante invests his female personages with. And
But the important thing here is that he's talking about a stage in his poetic vocation. When he seems to be going back to that episode here, in the line of virtu amor. Let's see, what is it? Amor acceso di virtu sempre alto acceso. It seems to be a revision of Francesca, doesn't it? And then.
Yeah, it almost sounds like a Stil Novo line, doesn't it? Yeah.
And but he's going back to his own poetic vocation, and then the next step with Virgil, he becomes Statius, learning poetry from Virgil, being transformed by Virgil. It just seems like this is all about Dante, as you pointed out. So
Oh yeah, right.
This is all about Dante's poetic vocation.
Carissimo.
Talk about Virgil and one of the Dante. One of the things I think is important is the feminization. Dante's Christianity and the feminization of Christianity, as opposed to the earlier church fathers who were much tougher. This version of and later on of heaven that Dante is going to give us is not like the church fathers, like Augustine, whose souls in heaven get a lot of pleasure, looking down at the soul suffering in hell. This is one of the pleasures that Augustine promises us in heaven. We can laugh at people who are suffering in hell. But this is certainly not Dante's view.
Right.
And this is a big step forward, and I think a feminization of Christianity that Dante is giving us a very patriarchal view of the church fathers.
Right. Yes.
I just wanted to kind of piggyback about Frederick so much. I find the images of the women very painterly. Like
Well, he's limited to citing them as examples, and he's really saying, I think, take for instance, and there's the name and the phrase that, and it's like, and here's the man who made the insult funny, Rodney Dangerfield. I mean, it's a kind of a tag whereby he identifies an example that people, all these people who had been to school with him, or in a school like his, who learned, who had to read the Thebaid for homework, knew these characters, and could fill in the details for themselves. But your point that the brush stroke that he chooses seems to, if I understand you correctly, seems to bring them to a kind of vividness and into life, I think is just testimony to our dealing with something other than a mediocre poet here. Dennis?
Can you fill in my ignorance here?
Hi.
The whole interpretation of the fourth eclogue of Virgil, how did that come about, and when did it come about as a prophecy of the coming of Christ in the Christian age? I mean, I understand that it was sort of settled in Dante's time, but
I don't really know. I know the authors cited are usually Comparetti, late 19th century Italian author on Virgil and on medieval Virgil and his legacy for the Middle Ages. Tofanin, Secolo senza Dante, and Perché l'umanesimo comincia con Dante. I think those are the authors that kind of explore the philological analogs of this interpretation of the fourth eclogue. I feel relatively certain that it is not an invention on Dante's part, but that it was there, and he's just itching to put it into his machine here and make it really work for him. I mean, one of the points I tried at some length to make tonight was that he doesn't have something like that for the prodigality, but what the heck, he'll take this thing about avarice and have it misunderstood to mean prodigality, and then he's got two versions of a kind of Christianized interpretation, or an interpretation that Virgil is not fully aware of, isn't fully conscious of, and that way he can leap from the bucolics to the Aeneid, and of course that's where how he gets there by this sort of knight's move in chess to where he really wants to be, the Aeneid, which has this view of history that he is both expropriating and transforming in the comedy. So no, I can't really fill in your.
Are you saying it was a medieval phenomenon? It doesn't go way back to early Christianity, or you're not?
I'm not saying that. I don't think it is, but don't rely on my impressions. Sandy, when I'm really retired, I'm going to read Comparetti and Tofanin.
So I have my trusty Thebaid.
Hey.
It says in the footnote,
All right. Well, there you go. Nothing like Cepeno. Barbara.
Todd, that was wonderful, and I apologize for being late. And more's the pity for me, but you were wonderful as always. The other thing about, I'm going to sound really dumb now. The whole issue of poetry in this canto, and Dante as a poet and writer, is very strong, which you may have said in the beginning. And that the fact that he has to leave Virgil behind now or soon, doesn't Virgil just about disappear in the soon, the next canto or something?
Yes.
Because he sure he doesn't prefer Stazio to Virgil. And yet he...
But he trades up when he gets Beatrice.
But not, yes. But in a poetic way, Virgil is really still his great hero. And what I was trying to say, wait, I've kind of forgotten, was that this gives Dante another chance to praise Virgil
Oh, yeah.
through Statius
Right.
before he's left behind.
Right.
And you might have said that, and I might have missed
Well,
it.
and to the extent that he discovers or manufactures some deficiency in Statius, that only serves to boost the glory of Virgil. You know, when he notices that Virgil has gone, and he, you know, if I were sharper, I could quote you the canto and the verse, but he talks about the tremendous, in the most nostalgic tones, the sense of loss he feels at Virgil's departure, and how grateful he is to all that Virgil has undertaken for him, you know, going into the depths of hell and all the rest. And indeed, I think that is as Virgilian a passage in Dante as you will find, that kind of, you know, there are tears and things, that kind of nostalgia and melancholy that is so characteristic of Virgil and the Aeneid.
On another topic entirely, you mentioned the centrality of empire for Dante,
Yeah.
and how it pervades the entire comedy. And I think you've alluded to that before as well. Was Dante influenced by any historians as opposed to poets in arriving at this, what I must strikes me as an incredibly unique view?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think he knew Livy. You know, I don't think he knew.
I think he read Virgil as history.
Well, yes. He read Virgil as history. What's that? Well, there you go. Yeah. Right. You know, this is, I said this was dangerous, his thought, you know, that the empire was, you know, I believe that it is novel with Dante. I don't believe he owes this to any church fathers. And this is a well thrashed out piece of a topic of Dante study, that the church saw the church and the empire as being the sun and the moon. And Dante says no, that Providence ordained two suns for the guidance of humanity, so that the equivalence of church and empire is a really in-your-face message for the good authorities of the church.
The imperial rhetoric of the period,
Yeah.
the Hohenstaufen rhetoric, for example, talked very much about the empire being there first and being the sea.
Uh-huh,
And they
okay.
don't necessarily talk about the providence of the empire, but it's, I
Mhm.
think it's implied.
Well, to what extent do you think that this view of empire and this view of empire that you find in the comedy is
I think it is
related to?
Ghibelline and imperial propaganda.
Yeah, I think so
From the
too.
previous century.
I mean, it's kind of a post-Ghibellinism, I think, in Dante. I mean, you know, it has to be after the death of Henry VII. I mean, it just ain't going to happen, not yet.
But for 100
Yeah.
years, you've had this kind of stuff floating around.
Mhm.
It was very big in Florence. It was very popular in Florence. It was part of the anti-papal
What's that?
I just
sorry.
think there was a lot of pro-imperial rhetoric that was floating around Florence.
That attended the cause of Ghibellinism and the Hohenstaufens and the Swabians and the German Empire, Holy Roman Empire.
This kind of thinking, very much in line. If it's not the precise words of, the providential establishment of Rome for the sake of, if it's not those precise words, it's constantly emphasized that the empire came first. The Roman Empire came first, and then came the church within the territory, in that literature, which I wasted a number of years studying.
The whole idea that Dante's poem is divinely inspired and that he speaks prophetic truth in it is a blasphemy. The church may have beatified Fra Angelico, but it's never thought of doing that with Dante because there's it's really a.
And get rid of limbo, and
there's just lots to right. That Diademia is in limbo just because she's famous. Yeah. Well, I don't know, but Dante gets you. The genius of his poetry is that he gets you to think that this is all real, it's all authorized, it's all, it's Scripture authorizes it, pagan antiquity, history itself, all these authorize what he's doing. And all he has to do is step up, clear his throat, and speak it out. He does at some cost to himself, certainly. I don't mean to diminish that, but that he does it fictionally, with all these. With this poetic construct of his, instead of, he had another life where he was ambassador for the bishops of Luni, and he was ambassador for Guido da Polenta in Ravenna, and all the political commissions and offices he exercised when he was, before his exile when he was in Florence, but. Those were the real things, and they certainly got him into enough trouble, and then some. But it's not. All those would be lost to us. The real Dante and the real politics and the real agitation for his ideals would be nothing without this fictional embodiment of it, which we take to be so real, and which is really just a few blots of ink on a page. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.